The waiting room smelled like floor cleaner and exhaustion. Marcus carried his son through the front door of the only clinic still open past Jayden's forehead burning against his neck. A small fever, nothing dangerous, but enough to make a father's hands shake. He found 2 empty chairs near the corner and sat down, pulling his boy closer. That was when Jayden lifted his head. His eyes, heavy glassy with sleep, locked onto a woman sitting alone across the room. She was beautiful. She was bruised. Jayden tugged his father's jacket and whispered, "Dad, I want her as my mom." 3 hours earlier, Marcus was still behind the wheel. The delivery van smelled like cardboard and cold sweat. He had been driving since 6 in the morning, weaving through traffic with a phone mounted on the dashboard, watching the orders pile up one after another. 12 hours, 47 stops. His lower back had gone numb somewhere around stop 30, and by the time he pulled into the warehouse lot to clock out, his fingers ached from gripping the steering wheel in the January cold. He checked his phone. 2 missed calls from Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who watched Jayden after school. No voicemail. That either meant everything was fine or everything was about to not be fine. He called back while walking to his car, a 15-year-old sedan with a cracked windshield and a heater that worked only when it felt like it. "He's been sneezing," Mrs. Patterson said. "Nothing serious, but he didn't eat much dinner." Marcus thanked her, promised he'd be there in 20 minutes, and drove faster than he should have. That was the thing about raising a child alone. Every small detail felt like the beginning of something bigger. A sneeze today could be a hospital bill tomorrow, and hospital bills were the kind of thing that could collapse a month's worth of careful budgeting in a single afternoon. Jayden was sitting on Mrs. Patterson's couch when Marcus arrived, watching a nature documentary about elephants. The boy looked up and smiled, not the wide, careless grin of most 8-year-olds, but something quieter, something that always seemed to carry more weight than it should. Jayden had been like that since he was old enough to walk. He watched. He listened. He noticed things that most adults missed, and he rarely asked for anything. That last part was what kept Marcus up at night. A child who never asks for anything is a child who has already learned not to expect it. "Hey, big man," Marcus said, kneeling down. He pressed the back of his hand against Jayden's forehead. Warm, not alarming, but warm. "I'm okay, Dad," Jayden said. His voice was scratchy, and he sniffled between words. Marcus scooped him up anyway. Jayden didn't protest. He just rested his head against his father's shoulder the way he always did when he was too tired to pretend he didn't need to be carried. They needed a few things from the store. Cough syrup, orange juice, and something for dinner that didn't come from a can. The supermarket on 8th Street was the closest one, still open, a fluorescent-lit box wedged between a laundromat and a check-cashing place. Marcus set Jayden in the shopping cart, even though the boy was technically too big for it, and pushed through the automatic doors. The store was half empty at that hour. A teenager restocking shelves. A couple arguing quietly in the cereal aisle. An old woman with a cane moving slowly past the produce section. Marcus headed straight for the medicine aisle, one hand on the cart, the other scrolling through his phone to check which brand of children's cough syrup was cheapest. That was when he heard the crash. It came from the front of the store, a sharp clattering sound followed by a thin cry. Marcus turned the cart around and saw the old woman on the floor near the checkout lanes. Her cane had slipped on something wet, and she had gone down hard, her groceries scattered around her. A woman was already kneeling beside her. She had appeared from nowhere, or maybe she had been there the whole time, invisible the way quiet people often are. She was helping the old woman sit up, one hand on her back, the other gathering the fallen items. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if she understood exactly how fragile the moment was. Then a store employee rushed over a young man with a name tag and an expression that suggested he was already calculating the liability. "Ma'am, did you push her?" he said, looking directly at the kneeling woman. She looked up, startled. "What? No, I was helping her." A customer nearby, a middle-aged man with a basket of frozen dinners, shook his head. I saw her standing right next to the lady when she fell. She was right there. The old woman tried to speak, but her voice was thin, confused. The employee stepped closer to the kneeling woman, his tone shifting from concern to accusation. I'm going to need you to stay right here. I'm calling the manager. Marcus watched the whole thing unfold from 15 feet away. He had seen what happened clearly, completely. The woman had not been standing next to the old lady before the fall. She had come from the next aisle over, moving quickly the moment she heard the sound. She had done exactly what anyone with basic decency would do, and now she was being treated like a suspect. He left the cart where it was and walked over. She didn't do anything, Marcus said. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that comes from years of having to be twice as measured in every confrontation. I saw the whole thing. The lady slipped. This woman came to help. That's it. The employee looked at Marcus, then at the other customer, then back at the woman on the floor. The accusation deflated slowly, like air leaking from a tire. The manager never came. The old woman was helped to her feet. The kneeling woman stood up, brushed off her coat, and looked at Marcus. Thank you, she said. It was only 2 words, but the way she said them told Marcus more than a full conversation would have. There was gratitude, yes, but underneath it was something else, surprise. As if she was not used to someone stepping forward on her behalf. As if that small act of witness was something rare in her world. Marcus nodded. He noticed her face fully for the first time. She was striking high cheekbones, dark hair, pulled back loosely green eyes that held a sharpness even through the exhaustion behind them. And on her left cheekbone, partially hidden by a strand of hair, a bruise. Not old, not fresh. Somewhere in between that sickly yellow-purple stage that meant it had been there for days. He didn't ask about it. He knew better. She turned and walked toward the exit without buying anything. Marcus went back to his cart where Jayden was sitting quietly watching the woman leave. The boy's eyes followed her all the way to the door. He didn't say a word, but his expression was the one Marcus had learned to pay attention to, the one that meant Jayden had seen something important. They finished shopping in 10 minutes. Jayden sneezed 3 times in the car. By the time they got home, his forehead was warmer. Marcus gave him soup, half a dose of cough syrup, and put him in his pajamas. But an hour later, Jayden's temperature had climbed. Not dangerously, but enough. 101.2 on the old thermometer Marcus kept in the bathroom drawer. He could wait until morning. Most parents would. But Marcus had learned the hard way that wait until morning was a luxury for people with good insurance and a partner to share the worry with. He had neither. The clinic on Fulton Avenue was the only one in the neighborhood that stayed open until midnight. It served the uninsured, the underinsured, the people who worked too many hours to see a doctor during the day. Marcus had been there before, once for Jayden's ear infection, twice for his own back problems. The waiting room was always full, the staff was always tired, and the fluorescent lights always buzzed like trapped insects. He carried Jayden through the front door at 10:20. And that was where this story began, with 2 empty chairs in the corner, a woman sitting alone across the room, and a boy who saw something the rest of the world had missed. Now Marcus sat with those 5 whispered words still ringing in his ears, watching Clara, though he didn't know her name yet, from across the room. The bruise on her cheek was more visible under the clinic's harsh lighting. She sat very still, hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed on the floor. She looked like someone who had run out of places to go and had settled for the nearest chair. A few minutes passed. Jayden coughed sharp and dry, the kind that turns heads in a quiet room. Clara looked up. Her eyes met Marcus's briefly, then moved down to the boy in his arms. "Is he okay?" she asked. Her voice was soft, almost reluctant, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. "Just a fever," Marcus said. "He'll be fine." She nodded. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a wrapped butterscotch candy. She held it out toward Jayden, her hand steady but her eyes uncertain. "Would that be all right?" she asked Marcus, not the boy. She was asking permission. It was a small thing, but it told him something. She understood boundaries. She respected them. Marcus nodded. Jayden took the candy, unwrapped it slowly, and looked up at the woman. He didn't smile. He did something that to Marcus felt far more significant. He held her gaze, steady, unafraid, as if he was telling her without words, "I see you." The woman's eyes glistened for just a moment. She blinked it away quickly and looked back down at the floor. Marcus sat there, his sun warm against his chest, the candy wrapper crackling softly in Jayden's small hand. He was a careful man, a guarded man. 6 years of doing everything alone had taught him to keep his walls high and his expectations low. Jayden's mother, Denise, had left when the boy was 2, not out of cruelty, but out of an honest inability to carry the weight. Marcus had closed that door a long time ago and kept moving, but his son had never steered him wrong. Jayden didn't speak often, but when he did, his words carried a weight that Marcus had learned to respect. The boy had an instinct for people, an ability to sense what lived beneath the surface. He had once refused to go near Marcus's co-worker, a man everyone liked who was later arrested for fraud. He had once hugged a stranger at a bus stop, an older man who Marcus later learned had just lost his wife that morning. Jayden didn't explain these things. He simply knew. And tonight, he had asked for exactly one thing in 8 years of life. Marcus was not the kind of father who ignored that. Marcus did something he almost never did. He started a conversation with a stranger. "Busy night," he said, directing the words toward the woman without looking directly at her. It was the kind of thing people said in waiting rooms, meaningless, safe, designed to fill silence without demanding anything in return. The woman glanced up. Her green eyes swept over him quickly, the way someone checks a doorway when they hear a sound not curious but cautious, measuring the threat level. "Yeah," she said, one word. Then she looked away. Most people would have stopped there. Marcus almost did. But Jayden shifted in his arms, turning his body so he was facing the woman, and let out another raspy cough. The boy's eyes were half closed, but he was watching her through the narrow slits, the way a cat watches from a windowsill, still patient, completely focused. The woman heard the cough and looked back. This time her gaze stayed longer. She studied Jayden's face, his small hand gripping the collar of Marcus's jacket, the flushed skin of his cheeks. Something in her expression softened, but it was a guarded softness, the kind that comes with a cost, as if every time she allowed herself to feel something tender, she expected to pay for it later. "How long has he had the fever?" she asked. "Started a couple hours ago," Marcus said. "It's probably just a cold, but I didn't want to take chances." She nodded slowly. "You're a good father." The words hit Marcus in a place he hadn't expected, not because they were profound, but because of how she said them with a quiet certainty, as if she had enough experience with the opposite to know the difference. "I try," he said. They sat in silence for a while after that. The waiting room hummed with the low sounds of a place that never fully rested, a television mounted in the corner playing the news on mute, a baby fussing somewhere down the hall, the soft shuffle of a nurse's shoes on linoleum. Jayden broke the silence. The boy reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out the small notebook he always carried, a dollar store composition book with a bent cover. He opened it to a blank page, pulled out a stubby pencil, and began sketching. After a few minutes, he tore the page out carefully and held it toward the woman. Marcus looked at the drawing. It was simple 3-stick figures standing under what appeared to be a large tree, one tall, one medium, one small. The tall one had dark skin colored in with heavy pencil strokes. The small one was clearly a child. The medium one had long hair. The woman took the drawing. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers trembling almost imperceptibly at the edges of the paper. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She held the tears the way someone holds a breath underwater, controlled, disciplined, as if letting go would mean drowning. "That's beautiful," she said to Jayden. Her voice cracked on the second word just barely. "Thank you." Jayden smiled, small and brief but real, the kind of smile he reserved for moments when he felt genuinely understood. Then he leaned back against Marcus's chest and closed his eyes. Marcus watched the woman fold the drawing carefully and slip it into her purse. She handled it like it was something valuable, something worth keeping. "I'm Marcus," he said. He wasn't sure why. The words just came out carried by something he couldn't name. She looked at him again. The caution was still there, but it had shifted less like a wall, more like a window, with the curtain pulled halfway back. "Clara," she said, the name settled between them. Neither of them reached for more. They just sat two strangers in a fluorescent-lit room connected by nothing more than a child's drawing and a shared understanding that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is simply being in a room with someone and not pretending to be fine. A nurse called a name. Someone stood up and walked down the hallway. The television flickered. Clara's hands tightened in her lap, then released a rhythmic clenching and unclenching like a heartbeat made visible. "You don't have to tell me anything," Marcus said. He kept his voice low, not out of secrecy, but out of respect, the way you speak near someone who is hurting. "But if you want to talk, I'm not going anywhere for a while." Clara studied his face the way she had studied Jayden's drawing, carefully searching for something she was afraid might not be there. Whatever she was looking for, she must have found it because she took a breath and began to speak. She didn't start with the bruise. She started with something smaller, the fact that she hadn't eaten since that morning, that she had left her apartment without her phone charger, that she didn't know what time it was because she had stopped wearing a watch 2 years ago. These were the edges of the story, the safe parts, the details that didn't cost too much to share. Marcus listened without interrupting. He had learned a long time ago that listening was not about waiting for your turn to speak. It was about making space for someone else's words to exist without judgment. Clara's voice grew steadier as she talked, as if speaking was a muscle she was remembering how to use. She mentioned a man named David. She didn't say, "my boyfriend," or "my partner." She said, "the person I live with," as if she had already begun the process of removing him from the categories that implied choice. David was the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone feel comfortable, everyone except the person who knew him best. He was charming in public, attentive at dinner parties, generous with compliments when other people were watching. Behind closed doors, the compliments became corrections. The attentiveness became surveillance. The charm became a tool wielded with precision, designed to make Clara feel like every problem in their relationship was something she had caused. He had never hit her. Not for a long time. What he did instead was worse in some ways because it left no marks that anyone could see. He told her she was too sensitive. He told her she remembered things wrong. He canceled plans with her friends and then denied he had ever agreed to them. He went through her phone while she slept and then accused her of hiding things when she changed her password. He made her feel crazy, and then he comforted her for being crazy, and the cycle repeated so many times that she forgot what the world looked like from the outside. The bruise on her cheekbone was the first time he had crossed the physical line. It had happened 2 days ago. She told Marcus this with a steadiness that frightened him more than tears would have the steadiness of someone who had spent years learning how to narrate their own pain without flinching. "I kept telling myself it would get better," Clara said. She wasn't looking at Marcus. She was looking at Jayden, who was sleeping now, his small chest rising and falling against his father's body. "I kept thinking if I just tried harder, if I was just better, he would stop. But there's no amount of better that's ever enough for someone like that." Marcus didn't offer advice. He didn't say, "You should leave," or "You deserve better," or any of the things people say when they want to help, but don't know how. He just said, "You don't have to explain yourself to me. But if you want to keep talking, I'm right here." Clara looked at him, the way people look at something they want to trust, but are afraid to, the way a stray dog looks at an outstretched hand, wanting to come closer, but remembering every hand that came before. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked. It was a genuine question. She truly didn't understand. Marcus thought about it. He could have said something about basic decency about how anyone would do the same, but that wasn't true and they both knew it. "Because my son asked me to," Marcus said. It was the most honest answer he had. Clara almost smiled. It didn't quite reach her mouth, but it lived in her eyes for a moment, a flicker of something warm in a landscape that had been cold for a long time. Then the front door of the clinic opened. The man who walked in was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark wool coat that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. He had the kind of face that belonged on a real estate billboard, square jaw, clean-shaved teeth that had clearly been straightened professionally. He scanned the room the way a searchlight sweeps a yard, methodical, possessive, looking for one thing and one thing only. His eyes found Clara. Marcus felt her change before he saw it. The air around her tightened. Her shoulders drew inward. Her hands, which had been resting open in her lap, closed into fists. It was a transformation that happened in less than 2 seconds. The woman who had been slowly opening up folded back in on herself like a flower retreating from frost. The man walked over. His stride was confident, unhurried, the walk of someone who believed every room he entered belonged to him. He stopped in front of Clara and looked down at her with an expression carefully constructed to resemble concern. "There you are," he said. His voice was warm, controlled the voice of a man who had practiced this exact tone. "I've been worried sick. You just disappeared." Clara didn't look up. "I told you I was leaving David." David crouched down to her level, placing one hand on her knee. The gesture looked tender from a distance. Up close, Marcus could see that his fingers were pressing into the fabric of her jeans, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to remind. "Baby, let's not do this here," David said. "Come home. We'll talk about it." Marcus sat very still. Jayden was sleeping against his chest, breathing through his mouth because his nose was too congested. Marcus kept one hand on the boy's back and watched. David finally noticed him. He straightened up and looked at Marcus with an expression that shifted through several stages in rapid succession, surprise, confusion, and then something colder. Something that narrowed his eyes and tightened the muscles around his jaw. "Who's this?" David asked Clara, but he was looking at Marcus when he said it. Not at him exactly, through him. The way someone looks at a piece of furniture that's in the wrong place. "He's just someone in the waiting room," Clara said quickly, the reflexive protection of a person who had learned that any connection, however innocent, could become ammunition. David turned to Marcus directly for the first time. He looked at Marcus's worn jacket, his work boots, the sleeping child in his arms. His eyes performed a calculation that was as visible as it was silent, taking inventory, assigning value, reaching a conclusion. "Right," David said. The single word carried an entire architecture of dismissal. He turned back to Clara. "Come on. The car's outside. Let's go home and figure this out like adults." "She said she told you she was leaving," Marcus said. David turned back to him. This time there was no pretense of politeness. "I'm sorry I'm talking to my girlfriend. This doesn't involve you." "I heard her say what she said," Marcus replied. His voice was even measured. He did not raise it. He did not lean forward. He had spent his entire adult life learning how to stand his ground without giving anyone an excuse to call him aggressive. "Seems like she already made a decision." David's jaw tightened. He took a step closer to Marcus, close enough that Marcus could smell his cologne, something expensive, something designed to project authority. David looked at him the way a man looks at something he considers beneath his concern, but temporarily inconvenient. "Listen, friend," David said, stretching the last word like a rubber band. "I don't know what's going on here, and I don't really care. But this is between me and her, so maybe you should focus on your kid and mind your own business." The words landed exactly where they were aimed. Marcus felt them hit not the words themselves, but the dismissal behind them, the assumption that his presence here was irrelevant, that his voice carried no weight in this room. It was a feeling he recognized the way you recognize a street you've walked down 1,000 times. He had been dismissed like this before by teachers, by landlords, by police officers, by men who wore expensive coats and spoke in controlled voices and believed that authority was something you were born with rather than something you earned. He did not react to it. Not because he didn't feel it, but because Jayden was sleeping on his chest, and Marcus had made a promise to himself a long time ago that his son would never see him become the version of himself that other people expected. Instead, he looked at Clara. Only at Clara. And he asked her a question that was simple enough for a child to understand, but heavy enough to change the course of a night. "Do you want to go with him?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. David straightened. Clara looked up, not at David, not at Marcus, but at something between them, something invisible that only she could see. The question had done something that no amount of arguing or confronting could do. It had given her back the one thing David had spent years taking from her: a choice. The waiting room had gone quiet. The nurse behind the reception window was watching. An elderly man in the corner had lowered his magazine. Even the muted television seemed to hold its breath. Clara looked at David. She looked at him fully directly in a way she hadn't looked at him in a long time. Not up at him, not away from him, but straight at him, as if she was finally seeing him at actual size instead of the inflated version he had built of himself. "No," she said. David blinked. His expression didn't change immediately. It took a moment, the way a crack takes a moment to spread through glass. The carefully maintained mask of concern shifted into something raw. His lips pressed together. His nostrils flared slightly. "After everything I've done for you," David said. His voice dropped lower, taking on the wounded quality of a man who had always used his own generosity as leverage. "I gave you a home. I took care of you. And this is what I get." Clara's hands were shaking. Marcus could see them trembling in her lap, but her voice did not shake. When she spoke again, each word came out clean and separate, like stones placed one by one into a wall. "I'm not going back. Not tonight. Not ever." David stood there. For a moment the mask slipped completely and Marcus saw what lived underneath, not anger exactly, but something worse. Ownership. The baffled fury of a man who has lost control of something he considered his property. David leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hiss that only Clara and Marcus could hear. "You're making a mistake. You know you can't do this on your own. You've never been able to do anything on your own." Clara flinched. The words hit something deep, something that had been told to her so many times it had calcified into belief. Marcus saw the flinch and recognized it, the involuntary recoil of someone being struck by a weapon that leaves no bruises. But then something happened that no one in the room expected, least of all Clara herself. Jayden stirred in Marcus's arms. The boy's eyes opened, still heavy with fever and sleep, and he looked directly at Clara. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply reached out his small hand, still sticky from the butterscotch candy, and placed it on the armrest closest to her palm, up, open, waiting. Clara looked at that hand. She looked at the small fingers, the slightly dirty nails. And something in her face changed. It was not a dramatic transformation, it was quieter than that, deeper. It was the look of someone who has been drowning and has just felt the bottom of the pool beneath their feet. She placed her own hand next to his on the armrest, close enough to almost touch, and turned back to David. "I need you to leave," she said. David opened his mouth to speak, but the nurse behind the reception window had already picked up the phone. A security guard, a tired-looking man in a blue uniform, appeared from the hallway. "Sir, is there a problem here?" the security guard asked. David looked around the room. He was a man who understood audiences, who knew when the performance was no longer working. The concerned boyfriend, the wounded lover, the reasonable man. None of those characters were going to play in this room, not anymore. He straightened his coat. He looked at Clara one last time with an expression that was not a goodbye, but a promise, the kind of promise that lives in the silence between words, the kind that says, "This is not over." Then he walked out. The door closed behind him. The waiting room exhaled. Clara sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then her shoulders began to tremble. It started small, a vibration barely visible, and then it moved through her body like a wave, the delayed reaction of someone who has just walked across a tightrope and only now, on solid ground, realizes how high up she was. She didn't cry. She breathed, deep, ragged breaths that sounded like they were being pulled from somewhere far below the surface. Marcus didn't touch her. He didn't move closer. He understood that in this moment space was more valuable than comfort. She had just done the hardest thing she had ever done. She had said no to the person who had spent years convincing her that no was not a word she was allowed to use. Jayden's eyes had closed again. His small hand was still resting on the armrest. Clara looked at it. Then slowly, carefully, she placed her fingertips against his. The boy shifted in his sleep and his fingers curled gently around hers, an unconscious reflex, the kind of trust that only children are capable of. Marcus sat in the quiet that followed and let the weight of what had just happened settle around him. Clara had lost everything tonight, her home, her relationship, whatever fragile structure she had built her life around. She was sitting in a free clinic with nothing but a purse and a child's drawing folded inside it. She had nothing, and for the first time in years, she was free. The nurse called Jayden's name at 11:40. Marcus carried his son down the hallway and into a small examination room, where a doctor with tired eyes and a gentle voice checked the boy's temperature, looked in his ears and throat, and told Marcus what he already suspected, a mild upper respiratory infection, nothing that rest fluids and over-the-counter medicine wouldn't fix. She wrote a note with instructions, reminded him to keep Jayden hydrated, and sent them on their way. The whole visit took less than 15 minutes. Marcus walked back into the waiting room with Jayden draped over his shoulder, the boy's arms hanging loose, his breathing slow and heavy with sleep. Clara was still sitting in the same chair. She hadn't moved. Her coat was zipped up to her chin now, and her hands were tucked under her arms the way people hold themselves when they are cold or afraid, or both. The waiting room had emptied out. Only a few people remained scattered across the plastic chairs like the last passengers on a late-night bus. Marcus stopped near the door. He should leave. Jayden needed to be in bed. It was almost midnight on a weeknight, and Marcus had a 6 o'clock shift in the morning. Every practical part of his brain told him to walk through that door, drive home, put his son to sleep, and let this night become a story he told no one. But Clara was sitting there, and she had nowhere to go. He knew this because of the way she was looking at the wall, not at the door, not at the clock, not at her phone. At the wall. People who have somewhere to go look at the time. People who have no one to call look at the wall. Marcus shifted Jayden's weight to his other shoulder and walked over. "They're closing soon," he said. Clara looked up at him. Her eyes were dry, but the exhaustion in them was the kind that went deeper than a single night. It was the tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for years and had just set it down only to realize that her arms no longer knew what to do when they were empty. "I know," she said. Marcus didn't ask her where she was going. He didn't ask if she had family, friends, a backup plan. Those questions, however well-intentioned, would have sounded like an interrogation, and she had endured enough interrogations for one lifetime. Instead, he said, "I don't know where you need to be, but I've got a car outside and I can take you somewhere safer than a parking lot at midnight." Clara studied him. Marcus could feel the weight of her hesitation. It was almost physical, like standing in front of a door that opens both ways and not knowing which direction leads out. She had just walked away from a man who controlled her. The idea of getting into a car with another man she barely knew must have felt like trading one cage for another. Her eyes moved from Marcus to Jayden. The boy was sound asleep, his cheek pressed flat against his father's jacket, his mouth slightly open, one hand still loosely gripping Marcus's collar. He looked exactly like what he was, a child who trusted his father completely, who slept the way only children who feel safe can sleep. Clara stood up. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and picked up her purse. "There's a women's shelter on Garfield," she said. "I don't know if they have space, but I've heard they take walk-ins." "I know where Garfield is," Marcus said. "It's on my way." It wasn't on his way. They both knew that. But neither of them said anything about it because some lies are not deceptions. They are courtesies, small bridges built to help someone cross a gap they can't cross alone. The sedan was parked under a broken streetlight at the far end of the lot. Marcus unlocked the passenger door first, then went around to the back and laid Jayden across the rear seat using his own jacket as a pillow. The boy stirred, mumbled something about elephants, a leftover fragment from the documentary he had been watching at Mrs. Patterson's house, and settled back into sleep. Marcus got behind the wheel. The heater took 3 tries to start, and when it finally kicked in, it produced a thin stream of warm air that smelled faintly of dust and engine oil. Clara sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap, her body angled slightly toward the door, keeping the maximum distance the small car allowed. They drove in silence for the first few blocks. The streets were empty, glazed with the thin frost of a January night. Streetlights cast orange pools on the asphalt. A convenience store on the corner glowed like an aquarium, its lone cashier visible through the glass leaning on the counter reading something. The city looked different at this hour, quieter, more honest, as if the darkness had stripped away the noise and left only the bones of things. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. Jayden had curled into a ball on the back seat, his knees drawn up to his chest, Marcus's jacket bunched under his head. The boy looked smaller when he slept, more fragile, more like the 2-year-old Marcus had held alone in a hospital room the night Denise walked out. That was 6 years ago, but some memories don't age. They stay exactly as sharp as the night they were made. Clara spoke first. "You didn't have to do any of this." Marcus kept his eyes on the road. "I know." "Then why?" He thought about it. The honest answer had many layers. His son's whispered words, the bruise on her cheek, the way she had helped that old woman in the supermarket and been punished for it, the drawing Jayden had given her, the way she had said no to David, with a voice that trembled everywhere except the one place it mattered. But all of those reasons led back to a single thing. "Because somebody should have done it a long time ago," he said. "And nobody did." Clara turned her head toward the window. The streetlights painted moving stripes across her face. She was quiet for a while, and Marcus let the quiet be. When she spoke again, her voice was different, not softer but less guarded, as if the darkness inside the car had created a space where honesty was less expensive. "I used to be someone," she said. "Before David. I had a job, friends. I used to paint nothing serious, just watercolors on the weekends. He told me it was a waste of time. He told me a lot of things were a waste of time until eventually the only thing that wasn't a waste of time was him." Marcus listened. He understood the architecture of isolation. He had seen it in different forms, in different contexts. His own mother had stayed with a man who never hit her, but who made her feel small every single day until smallness became her default size. Marcus was 14 when she finally left, and it took her another 5 years to remember that she was allowed to take up space. Denise Jayden's mother, she left when he was 2, Marcus said. He hadn't planned to share this. It came out the way truth sometimes does not, because you decide to tell it, but because the moment makes it safe enough to exist. She wasn't a bad person. She just looked at the life we had and saw a weight she couldn't carry. I was angry for a long time. Then I was tired. Then I was just a dad. That's all I had room to be. Clara looked at him. In the dim light of the dashboard, her expression held something Marcus hadn't seen before. Not pity, not sympathy, but recognition. the look of someone who understands that strength and breaking are not opposites. They are neighbors. "Mrs. Patterson helps," Marcus added, and a small, tired smile crossed his face. "She's my neighbor. 72 years old, watches more television than any human being alive, and makes the worst meatloaf I've ever tasted. But she loves Jayden, and Jayden loves her, so we make it work." Clara almost laughed. It didn't fully materialize, it was more of a breath that carried the ghost of a laugh inside it, but it was there, and it mattered. They turned onto Garfield. The shelter was halfway down the block, a plain brick building with a small sign by the door and a light on in the front window. It didn't look like much. It looked like exactly what it was, a place for people who had run out of other places. Marcus pulled to the curb and put the car in park. The engine idled roughly the way old engines do, rattling like a man clearing his throat. The street was empty. A streetlight down the block flickered on and off in a broken rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. The shelter's front window glowed with a warm yellow light that looked out of place on a block full of dark storefronts and locked gates. Marcus thought about all the women who had walked through that door before, women carrying children, carrying bruises, carrying nothing but the decision to leave. He thought about his mother. He thought about Denise. He thought about how leaving sometimes looks like weakness to the people watching, but feels like the heaviest thing in the world to the person doing it. Clara didn't move right away. She sat in the passenger seat looking at the building through the windshield. Marcus understood. Walking through that door meant admitting something to herself, to the world that she had spent years avoiding. "You're going to be okay," Marcus said. He didn't know if it was true. He said it anyway, because sometimes people need to hear a thing before they can believe it. Clara reached for the door handle. Then she stopped and turned back to him. "Your son," she said. "He sees things, doesn't he? Things other people miss." Marcus looked in the rearview mirror at Jayden, who was curled up on the back seat, his face peaceful, his breathing steady. "Yeah," Marcus said. "He always has." "He saw me," Clara said. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. The weight of a woman who had spent years being looked at and never once being seen. From the back seat, a small voice drifted forward. Jayden was not fully asleep. His eyes were barely open, narrow slits of awareness in a face soft with fever and exhaustion. He was looking at Clara through the gap between the front seats. "You can stay," he said, his voice thick and drowsy, the words half swallowed by sleep. "Until the scary part is over." Clara's breath caught. She pressed her lips together hard, her chin trembling. She didn't reach for Jayden's hand this time. Instead, she did something different. She pressed two fingers gently against the car window, right where the boy's reflection shimmered in the glass. A goodbye that was also a thank you. A touch without touching. Then she opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Marcus didn't call after her. He didn't ask for her phone number. He didn't say, "Let's keep in touch," or "Call me if you need anything." Instead, he leaned slightly toward the open door and said, "You know where the clinic on Fulton is. I'm there every time this one sneezes." It was light, almost a joke. But underneath it was something real, an open door offered without pressure, left unlocked for whenever she was ready to walk through it. Clara stood on the sidewalk. The night air was cold around her. She had no phone, no home, no plan. She had a coat, a purse, and inside it a child's drawing of 3 figures standing under a tree. She looked back at Marcus through the car window, and she smiled. It was small and real and unguarded, given freely without cost. Then she turned and walked toward the shelter. The door opened. A light from inside spilled across the threshold. She stepped through it and disappeared. Marcus sat in the car for a long moment. The heater wheezed. The dashboard clock read 12:17. In the back seat, Jayden had fallen asleep again, his breathing deep, and even the last traces of fever warming his cheeks. Marcus put the car in drive. He pulled away from the curb slowly, the old sedan groaning as it merged into the empty street. He had a 6 o'clock shift. He had medicine to buy in the morning. He had a son who needed soup and rest and clean pajamas. He had the same life he'd had when this night began. Nothing had changed, not really. He was still a man with a cracked windshield and a heater that worked when it felt like it, driving home through the cold with his boy asleep in the back. The bills would still be there in the morning. The alarm would still go off at 5:30. The route would still be 47 stops long. But something had shifted. Something quiet and nameless and too new to hold. 3 people had found each other in a fluorescent-lit room on a January night, not because fate had arranged it, but because a child had looked across a waiting room and recognized something that the adults had been too guarded to see. It was not a love story, not yet. It was not a family, not yet. It was a beginning, and for now, that was enough. Sometimes the people who change our lives don't arrive with a grand entrance. They show up in a waiting room at 11 o'clock at night with a bruise they didn't deserve and a kindness they almost forgot they had. And sometimes it takes a child, someone too young to know about walls and too wise to build them, to remind us that the people worth trusting are the ones the world has overlooked. Marcus didn't save Clara that night, and Clara didn't complete Marcus's family. What happened was something smaller and in many ways more powerful. 3 strangers chose to see each other honestly without pretending. In a world that teaches us to look away, they looked. In a room full of people staring at their phones, a boy put down his pencil and drew a picture of what he wished his life could be. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone or made you think about the moments in your own life when a stranger's kindness meant everything, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Tell me, have you ever met someone in the most unexpected place at the most unexpected time and felt like maybe it wasn't an accident? And if you know someone who needs to hear this story tonight, someone who might be sitting in their own waiting room wondering if anyone sees them, share it with them. Sometimes a story is the hand on the armrest. Sometimes it's the only thing that tells someone they're not alone. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. I'll be here. Every time you come back, there'll be something new waiting. And who knows, maybe next time it'll be your story.